Perfect. Hello, everyone. I'd like to first thank the Oley Foundation for the recognition. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to be here today and to share with you all some of my research. So the title of today's talk is Sleep Patterns of Adults Receiving Home Parenteral Nutrition. I'll be talking about findings from a recent study that we have concluded. I'll also share some of our ongoing studies in case you would like to participate in future studies, and also some of the things that we have in mind for the future. So I have nothing to disclose, but I really want to start with some acknowledgements. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Oley Foundation and members of the Oley Foundation. I'm going through the list of participants, and I recognize a lot of members who have actually contributed to the research that I'll be presenting today. So thank you all for making this a possibility and recognizing that sleep is a really important topic that has been understudied in this community. I also want to recognize Aspen, who has funded the research that I'll be presenting. And then I also want to acknowledge my collaborators and my clinical research coordinators who have made this research possible. So thank you all. Okay. I think we all recognize the importance of sleep, but just to reiterate some important points about the importance of sleep. Why is sleep important, or what is sleep important for? And these are some of many other functions that sleep plays, starting with brain function and brain health. So although during sleep, our body is sedentary, we are relaxing, certain regions of the brain are actually hyperactive and are performing various tasks, including creating new memories, as well as learning new functions. And this happens predominantly during our sleep. Sleep is also important for physical function. So active repairing and healing happens during our sleep, including repairs of our heart and blood vessels. And sleep is also important for daytime performance and safety. So if we get enough sufficient quality sleep, we're able to function well throughout the day, the following day. A lot of what we know about the importance of sleep comes from different studies where they compared people who sleep very few hours a night, maybe 3 or fewer hours a night, to people who sleep sufficiently, 7 to 9 hours. And also from sleep deprivation studies where adults primarily are put in a sleep lab and they have them sleep for only 3 to 4 hours a night and study what kind of health effects that sleep deprivation inflicts. And what these investigations have shown over and over again is that sleep deprivation leads to impaired cognition. We're less able to make good decisions if we're sleep deprived. Sleep deprivation leads to higher levels of anxiety. Sleep deprivation leads to increased risk for several diseases, including risk for stroke, heart disease, diabetes, as well as breast cancer. Sleep deprivation also leads to potentially weight gain and an increase in depressive symptoms, which all again suggests that sleep is highly central and it's an important pillar of health, just like physical activity and nutrition. And a lot of what we have known so far about sleep came from very few survey studies, quality of life specifically studies, that have been conducted where participants who are receiving or who were receiving home parenteral or enteral nutrition were asked about different aspects of their sleep. And this is one of several studies that were led by Dr. Marianne Winkler in different populations where she had asked about the quality of life of different participants. This specific study asked 70 adults with intestinal failure about 2 certain aspects of their sleep. The first question was, in the past 2 weeks, how often have you experienced these things? My sleep was disrupted by PN pumps. And in response to that question, 21% and 15% of The responders said often or always having their sleep disrupted because of PN pumps. Another question was, my sleep was disrupted because I had to get up to urinate. And for this specific question, even more participants said often or always. 40% said often having their sleep disrupted, 37% said always having their sleep disrupted because they had to get up to urinate. So this is probably not new news for many of you. What these self-reported studies are unable to do is really quantify or evaluate the extent of this disruption because it is based off of self-report. So with support from the Aspen Rhodes Research Foundation, what we wanted to do is objectively look at the sleep patterns of adults receiving home parenteral nutrition. So this specific study has actually been published earlier this year in the Journal of Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition. If you'd like a copy of the study, feel free to email me after the call, after the seminar today. So what I'll be presenting over the next couple of slides are some of the results from this home-based remote sleep study, where instead of using self-report, we used this watch called a wrist accelerometer, kind of like a Fitbit, that monitors wrist motion as well as light exposure in order to help us better determine sleep, different aspects of sleep duration and quality. So because this was a remote home-based study, partly in response to COVID, we approached the study slightly differently from what we had intended. We recruited participants primarily through Facebook and the Oley Foundation. Participants who were interested completed online screeners in order for us to determine their eligibility. We met with our participants over Zoom from the convenience of our participants' homes and sometimes even cars. We then sent a parcel that included the wrist watch to our participants to their home address. Our participants wore the watch for 7 consecutive days, where it helped us monitor their sleep for 7 consecutive nights. And then after completing that week of assessment, the parcel was sent back to us using a pre-labeled and prepaid envelope. Because of the remote nature of this study, we were able to recruit participants from several states. In fact, we recruited participants from 13 different states spanning the entire US. And to describe to you the general characteristics of our participants, the average age was around 52 years old. 80% of our participants were female. The majority of our participants, or 60%, reported having short bowel syndrome. Many of our participants have been on home PN for a while. The average was 10 years. Most of our participants cycled their infusions overnight, 85%, whereas very few cycled during the daytime or had continuous feeds. And the average cycling durations was around 12 hours per day. So this is an example of the data that we retrieve for our watches. And I'll walk you through how to read this plot. It might seem a bit intimidating at first. Each row of this figure is a day of the week. So since this was a 7-day study, there are a total of 7 rows here. And this goes from noon time to noon time. So each row goes from noon to noon. The yellow bars are light exposure. So if a participant is exposed to a lot of light, you'll see a higher yellow bar. The black bars are activity. So anytime a participant moves the wrist vigorously, you'll see an activity or a black bar there. And then the blue bands here are what we had determined as time in bed or sleep episodes, or a time in bed. And then using a combination of the sleep time or the time in bed, as well as the light exposure and activity, we can then determine different aspects of sleep, including sleep duration, total time in bed, wake after sleep, so how many minutes participants were awake after initially falling asleep, and how quickly it took our participants to fall asleep. The first thing that becomes hopefully obvious to you when you just look at this figure is all this yellow and black bars that are happening during these periods of spending time in bed. And this reflects that for this specific participant, They usually wake up every 2 to 3 hours, probably to urinate, and expose themselves to a lot of light. The other thing that I wanted to point out that might be obvious from looking at this is that this participant had a fairly consistent sleep-wake schedule. They went to bed almost at the same time every day, and woke up roughly around the same time, although you do see some fluctuations here. And I'll get to this a bit more later on. But these are data from one participant. So what did it look like for our 20 participants who completed this study? So over the next couple of slides, I'll be showing you a series of data regarding the sleep of all 20 of our participants. Starting with sleep duration. So sleep duration is the total amount of time our participants spent asleep. And the recommendation for sleep duration for adults is 7 to 9 hours per night. The way to read this plot is you have hours on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, you have each of our 20 participants. So each box here reflects one of our 20 participants, and then you have the group average all the way here at the end. The gray band that I've highlighted here is the recommended duration for sleep duration, so 7 to 9 hours. So if a box falls within this gray band, this tells you that this particular participant was meeting the 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. Whereas if a box falls above or below, that tells you that they're either short or long sleepers. So what we found was that the population average for sleep duration was approximately 7 hours. So the overall average fell towards the lower end of the recommended duration of 7 to 9 hours. What we found was that 55% of our participants, so all these participants that are on the right side of our plot, did not meet the recommended sleep duration of 7 to 9 hours. All these boxes are falling below the gray shaded region. Next, we looked at sleep onset latency. So now we're looking at how quickly our participants are able to fall asleep. The current recommendation for sleep onset latency is 15 minutes or less. So generally, adults should be able to fall asleep within 15 minutes. And very similar to the previous plot, I'm showing you data from all 20 participants with the gray shaded region here showing the 0 to 20 minutes, 0 to 15 minutes, which is what's recommended. What you can see here is that most of our participants actually are meeting the 15 minutes recommendation or less. All these boxes, almost all of them, fall below the 15-minute threshold, with a few exceptions. For example, we had one participant that spent over an hour in order to be able to fall asleep. But for the majority of our participants, this wasn't an issue. Only 35% were not able to fall asleep within 15 minutes, but the majority were able to fall asleep. So what these data tell us that participants on home PN are not having issues falling asleep. Instead, they seem to have issues maintaining sleep or staying asleep. So these results are for wake after sleep onset, which is the total time spent awake after initially falling asleep. And the current recommendation is to only spend up to 20 minutes awake after initially falling asleep. And what you can see very clearly is that most of our participants, most of these boxes fall above the 20 minutes threshold, which tells us that our participants have difficulty maintaining sleep. In fact, the average duration that we have estimated was an hour awake after initially falling asleep, which surpasses, it's almost 3 times higher than what is currently recommended. The other issue that we have found also was the prevalence of napping among our participants. So napping is generally recommended only for people who feel tired during the daytime, and they're recommended to limit their naps to 20 minutes. What we found in this study was that most of our participants do nap during the day. And not only do they nap, but their naps tend to be on the longer end. The average napping duration was around 65 minutes, and 65% of our participants reported taking at least one nap. Now, the issue with taking long naps and very frequent naps is sometimes it impedes your ability to fall asleep at night. And I'll get to some of those recommendations in a bit. So I showed you some of the patterns that we have identified through our sleep study, but it's important to keep in mind that there are many factors that contribute to poor sleep. I've alluded to the parenteral infusions. We know that overnight infusions lead to frequent urination, which sometimes causes people to wake up frequently. The PN pumps sometimes are disruptive to sleep, and PN infusions sometimes makes people less comfortable while they're asleep or restrict their sleep positions. It's important to keep in mind that there are other factors as well, in addition to the PN infusions, such as different comorbidities, especially mental health issues or depression might also result in poor sleep. Medications sometimes might be disruptive to sleep, and various nutritional deficiencies might also disrupt sleep. So it's not only the PN infusions. So the obvious thing that we wanted to examine was whether daytime infusions might lead, compared to overnight infusions, might help people sleep better. Before I describe to you the study that we have ongoing where we're assessing this, I wanted to share with you an article that was written by an HPN consumer, Nancy DeVry, that is published on the Oley Foundation website that talks about her specific experience with daytime infusions. So Nancy, as she describes in her article, felt that she was severely sleep deprived. However, it only took somebody else to notice that in her that she decided to experiment with daytime infusions. And when she did, she said that she now sleeps better through the night. She only gets up once or twice a night, as most non-TPN patients do. And she sleeps much better, which gives her more energy, and she no longer has dark circles under her eyes. I encourage you to read this article. You can scan this QR code here on the right to give you some insights into what people experience if they do decide to experiment with daytime infusions. But Nancy is one person. We wanted to systematically study this in a larger number of adults. So we have an ongoing study right now that aims to investigate whether daytime infusions of PN could lead to improved sleep quality in adults with short bowel syndrome. So if you are currently on overnight infusions of home PN and are living with short gut and would like to participate and would like to experiment with daytime infusions, our QR code is on the slide. You can scan the QR code or go to our study website to learn more about this study. This specific study is a 2-week study where we have participants continue overnight infusions for 1 week, and then for a second week, we ask them to experiment with daytime infusions. We're using the same technologies that we used in our previous study that I presented on in order to see whether the daytime infusions lead to improved sleep quality. Our participants do get paid for being part of this study. For our remote participants, we're paying $450. For our in-person participants in the Boston area, they get paid $750. So if you'd like to experiment with daytime infusions, feel free to reach out to us. However, it's important to keep in mind, as many of you probably are aware, that daytime infusions may be inconvenient. Many of our participants, especially in the trial, tell us that that 1 week of daytime infusions sometimes led to limited social interactions because they didn't want to leave the house while they're hooked up. Some participants complained about having various difficulties carrying their feeds with them. Some participants complained about frequent urination now during the day. And if your cycles are longer than 20 hours, sometimes daytime infusions might not make sense because it'll still overlap with your sleep. However, it's something worthwhile examining yourself. So to wrap up, I want to share some current sleep recommendations. These are general recommendations that might not necessarily apply to you, but they're general recommendations that are currently being made in order to get better sleep. So they're listed on the slide, and I'll go through them very quickly. Avoid stimulants at least 6 hours before bedtime. Avoid excessive food and liquid at night. Try to switch off your devices, although your smartphones, although this is hard to do in this era. Use bed only for sleep and get out of bed if you're unable to fall asleep. Limit your use of or obsession over using a clock watch if you're able to do so. And keep your room cool and dark in order to help you with your sleep. Particularly for people on home PN, try to maintain a regular sleep schedule. Try to go to sleep and wake up at the same time every day, including weekdays and weekends, because that'll help your body anticipate sleep and help you fall asleep quicker. Avoid taking naps if you don't need to take a nap. Sometimes taking too many naps affects your ability to fall asleep at night. And also expose yourself to bright light in the morning, but not bright light in the evening. Especially if you're using the bathroom at night during your sleep, try to limit the brightness of the light that you're exposing yourself to, because that could affect your ability to fall asleep, fall back asleep. Also, to help you with your sleep, try to talk to your clinicians about shorter infusion times, because that could help with your sleep quality. Consider daytime infusions if that's something that appeals to you. Join our study if you want to get paid to do that. See if there are any nutritional deficiencies that you need to address in order to help you with your sleep. Iron, for example, being one of them. Consider testing with different pumps. We've learned that some pumps are louder than others, so maybe try to switch your pumps if yours is particularly noisy. And lastly, limit your exposure to bright light at night, because that could be disruptive to sleep. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening. And again, I'd like to thank the Oley Foundation for supporting this research and for you all for being here today. And I'm happy to take any questions. I'm unable to start my video for some reason, but I'm here to take any questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Hassan. And I actually have a couple questions myself. This is something that affects our own family too. So basically, the first thing I want to say is, Dr. Winkler put in the comments to, if we're going to consider changing schedule, please talk with your provider first before you do this on your own. That is just a cautionary thing to make sure that we do. I think that the chronic sleep deprivation that we find ourselves in isn't even something we recognize sometimes. So thank you for bringing this to our attention. My question is specifically, I'm asking this question, is sometimes it's the alert awake. Like it's the alert awake, like you're finding yourself, if you wake up because you need to use the restroom, that's one thing, but like that alarm that all of a sudden starts blaring, I find that very difficult to go back to sleep afterwards, especially if something's wrong, and it's the longer and the more steps it takes in order to fix the problem. Do you have suggestions for how to go back to sleep after alert?
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah, there's a reason that the alarms are there, because there's something that you need to address. I know one of our participants switched out their pump to something that is less loud, and I think that still being able to respond to it, but not being frightened by it, helped him fall back asleep quicker. Again, we also need those alarms because they do serve a purpose. If you find yourself being responsive to a lower noise alarm, perhaps that's something worth considering.
Thanks.
But it's something for us to keep thinking about. I agree.
Yeah, it's something that I've trained myself not to fall asleep or to sleep through those. My son, though, who is the one that's the PN recipient, he sleeps right through all of it. He's fine. I'm the one that has to wake up and deal with it. So, and then obviously you address those that are on longer. Like my son is 20 hours on, and he's only got 4 hours off. And so for me, and I'm sure other people, it's not even really an option to do that. And so I have to choose very carefully where those 4 hours are that are off of PN. One of the questions is, can I join the study if I have intestinal motility issues and not been diagnosed with short bowel syndrome?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, For this specific study, we are restricting it to short bowel just because it's exploratory and we need to keep our population very homogeneous. But there are future studies that we'll be conducting that expands beyond just short bowel.
That would be great. I think we know that short gut or short bowel is 80 or something% is what I've heard of intestinal failure, but there's that other percent that is anxious to get in on some of these drug trials and anxious to be able to on some of these other studies. So let us know when you're ready to expand that beyond short bowel, because there's some people on intestinal motility or intestinal failure that would love to join too. So thanks. And then one more question here is, what color light would you recommend besides the brightness of the light at night? So is there a certain colors that are better for sleep?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what you want to do is limit your exposure to blue light. And it's not necessarily the color blue. I mean, so one way to go about it is to either switch out your bulbs to get the ones that have limited blue light in them, or to have the shades, the blue light blockers next to your bed that you could put on. Although they might look funny, but it's something worth experimenting with. Put them on as you switch on the lights, because limiting your blue light exposure at night will help you fall asleep quicker. There's also the night shift mode on your phones that limit automatically blue light exposure being emitted from your screens. So that's something else that you can try as well.
That's awesome. Thank you. And then I want to ask one last question of you. This is something that's come to my head as we've been talking today. Is there anything that surprised you in the study?
I think a couple of things actually. I think going into this, as naive as I was, everything that I found was new to me and exciting. I think the high prevalence of daytime napping was a bit surprising to me. And I've talked to some of your members about their napping experience, and what I've been told is that the napping is a different form of napping, and I'm really interested in exploring this further and seeing how it could be used, how napping could be used as an opportunity to recover and not necessarily a way to hinder our ability to fall asleep at night. The other thing was the light exposure at night. That was something that I had not thought of prior, and it wasn't until we saw the results that it became very clear to us that there's so much light being emitted from different sources.
Awesome.
Because many of our participants will continue doing overnight infusions because it's a quality of life issue. We are trying to establish guidelines for sleep or resources for sleep for adults on home PN, probably also kids as well. And that's something that we're trying to work on with the American Academy for Sleep Medicine. And hopefully that you'll hear more about it later on.
Well, that's very exciting to hear. Look forward to seeing that. And thank you, Dr. Dashti, for being here today. We look forward to more of your research in this area and hearing more about you. So thank you so much for joining us today.